Now I'm going to talk to you about a very difficult issue. It's an issue that sort of one would want to avoid because it takes you very quickly to Absurdistan, land of absurdity. And if you have a certain sense for this thing, that's not a place where you want to be. So the issue I want to talk about has to do with what is the reason for having human rights. So essentially, the problem is quite simple, and it's quite simple, but it's very hard to solve. The problem is simple, but the solution is seems to be out of reach. The problem is okay. If humans have rights, what is the ground or reason for them having rights? What is so special about them that justifies having them, giving them rights? Now, this is similar to the problem of rational justification of human rights, but it's not identical. So let me take you on this road. So essentially, what you see here is that the fear is that we need to find some property that humans have that justifies, for example, that they are treated especially where animals do not. The idea is that if you don't have a property like this, if you don't have an explanation, then you're being what's so-called a speciesist. Person that discriminates as a sexist person discriminates against women, and a racist person discriminates against certain races, and a speciesist person discriminates against animals. So he fails in the tribunal of reason. He stands condemned for having partiality that is not based on good grounds. So then the idea would be, well, first you would try to say, well, then the moral property that separates humans, especially important, cannot be sentience, because sentience is something that we share with animals. So our ability to suffer, our ability to feel pain, well, that cannot be really the basis of human rights, because if that's the basis of human rights, well, then human rights are like saying the rights of men or the rights of white men. It's not something to be proud of. You would want, let's say, sentient creature rights, and that would include animals. So that's a sort of start of the problem. Then the typical first move that is made to try to solve this is to say, well, then it's not sentience what gives us rights. It's something that is particularly human, and that is the ability to reason. Now, if you make the shift from sentience to reason, then you get sort of immediate solution to the problem of animal rights. And then some lots of people are fond of making that move. So you have, let's say, on the one side, people like Peter Singer saying, well, and following Bentham saying, well, what matters is not our ability to reason, what matters is our ability to suffer. But then other people say, no, what you really want to focus on is the ability to reason, because no, suffering is important, but what gives us our special dignity and special status as human beings, or what is the ground of the rights, is our ability to reason. But actually, if you make this move, you end up getting into a bigger problem than the one you started with. Here's the thing: the essential problem in the move from sentience to reason is that the power of reason is not equally distributed amongst human beings. You will have human beings with a greater power of reasoning and human beings with a lesser power of reasoning, and at certain extremes, you will have human beings that are not granted or recognize any power of reason whatsoever. That will include severely disabled persons, and will also include, for example, infants. And children would be, let's say, on the, depending on their age, surely on the more lower level of the list of the ability to reason. So they have not done equations yet, or they're not very good at them. And then if you take that route, then allegedly the problem becomes, well, now you manage to kick animals out of the picture, fine, so now it's human rights again, but it's not human rights for all humans. Really is human rights for rational humans, so full humans, or as the philosophical literature has evolved to use the word, so-called persons. And if you're a person, you have full human rights because the rights are owed to your rational nature. But then children have less rights, and then children have less rights, and the disabled persons have none, and infants have none eat also, or something very limited in terms of rights. And this result I regard as quite barbaric. I sort of even prefer to stay with Benham, to be honest. This result, which I regard quite barbaric, stands. It's not only that I disagree with it, and here you may agree or disagree, and that's really besides the point. It's also in complete contradiction to the whole of the law. Because if you see how the law has developed, and the law has developed not only say that children are protected and that people with disabilities are protected, the law even goes to say that children deserve more protection. No, children have more human rights than the rest of us. And of course, that's not just human rights, that's just common sense. The Titanic is sinking, and then you say, well, women and children first. And let's say now we want to say that women first, that's also a little bit sexist. I don't mind. But children first, that's perfectly fine. Both the sinking, adults, we put ourselves on the line. We take the plunge first. Try to save as many of the children as we can. That is, let's say, how it goes. And then if you were going in the opposite direction, so imagine some sort of applied ethicist in the sinking of the Titanic said, well, you know what? Those that can do equations go first. The really, really rational ones, those that are doing the calculus and the linear algebra and the computer programming, they certainly get the first spot, the first spot in the boat. And then children, I am very sorry, but you don't still have human dignity. You're not fully qualified. You're not a full person, so you don't quite have rights. Now, yeah, I think this is bizarre, and I'm not making this up, because these things are written down in the literature. So the problem is that you move from sentience, you move to reason, then you start to enter in problems with children and the disabled and so forth. And there's variants of this. So some people say, well, reason, but others say, well, autonomy. Other people say the ability to make plans. The same problem holds two different levels, right? So the ability to make plans, the ability to be autonomous, and so forth, are not equally distributed amongst human beings. And the moment you go into, let's say, the very, very old or the very, very young of the disabled, then they start to become, let's say, marginal instead of central cases. They become subjects with qualified rights or qualified protection, whereas international rights would say specifically for amongst all other things for children, they have a higher standard of protection. Now, if you want to see the law on this, I suggest you check the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Convention of the Rights of the Child is without parallel the most successful human rights document in achieving a virtual universal consensus. Now, no, human rights have been ratified by some states, not by others, but there's one that has been ratified by 99.9% of states, and that's the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So, well, what do you want to say? Do you want to say, well, we have this theory, and then all the law is wrong? Okay, that does not sound to me a very productive or attractive way of doing things. It might be the case that your theory is wrong, especially if you reach such a bizarre conclusion. But okay, here's the tricky part. If it's not sentience and it's not reason, what is the property that justifies that human beings have human rights? No, because we seemingly need this property, because otherwise the granting of human rights would be arbitrary. Then here's where things get complicated. Because if we are forced to answer this question and we have not accepted sentience and we have not accepted reason, and in mentioning reason, I also mentioned all those other similar things like ability to make plans, ability to make autonomous decisions, and so forth, we still do need to seem to have this need to come up with this answer, and that apparently is very tricky, or at least let's say I haven't found a good, straightforward answer in the literature. Now, I will tell you what the law will say. And the law, for all its, if you compare law and philosophy, one is up here and the other one is down here. Philosophy is much more abstract. You could say it's much more advanced than law is. Law is much more a thing we need every day, not something special, not something of the wise, but something that would work also in the market, something that will also work on the street. And the legal answer tends to be dignity. What is special about human beings? Well, they are endowed with dignity. You're going to find that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You're going to find it in the Inter-American system, the African system, in the European system. Even the more exotic systems of human rights, the ones that are not so well developed, will still mention, talk about human dignity. And of course, the German Constitution, which is a special. I think the German Constitution has a place without comparison in all these documents that talk about human rights because of the experience. So going out of the experience of the Nazi regime. So you think of the Nazi regime like an eclipse, this incredible darkness that also makes an element of light much more visible because precisely because of the contrast with the darkness. So you have this idea of human dignity. Well, what was special about human beings, what we have that we don't have, is human dignity. And that is something that you find in the criminal, that is something that you find in the disabled person, in the child, in the infant, in the elderly person, and so forth. And that is, let's say, one way of answering the question then, because we do have this thing that's called human dignity, and that is what makes us special. It's different from animals, and unlike reason, autonomy, and the ability to make plans, it's you something that you could say it's at a base level equally distributed amongst human beings. It is not something that would fluctuate with age or time and ability. In fact, you could say, well, the way dignity is experienced when you are a dependent person is different than when you are, let's say, a man in your 40s, really 30s. It might be different, but it's still that you have this basic human dignity. Now, when you're, let's say, when you're sick, when you're vulnerable, when you're a child, when you're infirm, then your dignity is still there and it calls for a different treatment. But okay, so there you seem to have an answer, but this answer has satisfied absolutely zero philosophers and absolutely, well, not want to say zero, but it has been seen to be a very unsatisfactory answer because the way the academic community hears this when they hear it, they say, well, aren't you just kicking the can one step further down the road? Because then we ask, okay, what is the thing that gives us our human dignity? What is the property that justifies that we have this dignity? So we have again you just entered the same problem, and then you see, well, people say, well, wait a second, animals have dignity too, and there is such a thing as animal dignity. For example, Martin Nussbaum goes on paper on that topic, which is, I guess it's I'm I find it hard to judge. Then people say, well, probably animals do have dignity, but maybe that's a different sort of dignity. And we start to enter into a very nebulous territory where it's very difficult to get a grip of what we're talking about. Reaching the point that some people just say, well, you know what dignity is? Dignity is just a conservative ploy. That is just what conservatives say when they want to oppose abortion or euthanasia or some of this, and that they just want to plug their morals onto us. Now, I think that's of course a very unfair characterization because when you get to dignity is when you have tried sentience and you have tried rationality and the ability to make plans, and you found that they will leave you shortchanged, that they will, in a very scary way, leave a lot of human beings outside the sphere of protection, and that's when you go to dignity. So I don't think it's a conservative ploy. Dignity is very understandable concern at any point of the ideological spectrum, or at least it's supposed to be. But then it seems not to do work because it just seems to push the can a little bit further. And so that is the problem of dignity. Now, I want to make a few remarks defending the idea of dignity from its seeming embarrassing, let's say, simple mindedness or just call it nakedness of dignity. Well, dignity, what's that? I don't know. Fluffiness, you could call it also. I want to say that dignity actually is pretty useful because what makes dignity fluffy is essentially what also makes it accurate. Now, sometimes fluffy is more accurate than precise. If you say, well, what is um, what is a science fiction movie? I say, well, it's a movie with aliens. That is precise and wrong. You can have science fiction movies without aliens. Well, it's a movie about the future. That again, that's precise and wrong. You can have science fiction movies that take place in the past and maybe in the distant past. So maybe a better way to talk about science fiction is say, you know what? It's a little bit hard to define what science fiction is. Here, let me give you an example. Here you have, let's say, Star Trek, Star Wars, Blade Runner, and something else that does not come to mind immediately right now. So, what is the one of, I haven't seen it, but it has very nice cinematography, the one. Okay, I mentioned one that I've seen that I've considered could be very terrible, Planet of the Apes. That's also science fiction. Fine. I don't like that one. But point being, sometimes instead of trying to pretend precision, you can say, here's an example, here's an example, here's another example, here's another example. And the idea that this is somehow unscientific is one that I think is just embarrassingly prejudiced. The idea that you need some sort of formal definition to things and that just going by examples and showing you this, and this is not very scientific, that for scientific you need this sort of rule and system based on rules. This is amazingly unscientific, actually. It's an amazingly unscientific prejudice. Because if we are anywhere in the era of the internet, which is also the era of neural networks, and you know how neural networks work, neural networks that predict which music you're going to like in Spotify, which movies to suggest in YouTube, or which words are to type when you're typing something in the Google search, which word is the next one you're going to type. No, the way neural networks work is essentially like that. Here's an example of the things Gustavo likes on YouTube. Here's another example. Here's another example. Give you more examples, which cannot necessarily be captured by a rule. And that's the things that he's gonna want to click on. So that is essentially how a neural network works. So why can I not say that dignity as a concept is fluffy? Because the point of the concept of dignity is that I am able to, instead of saying, okay, here's the rule of what makes human beings special, let me show you this. Let me show you a child playing. Let me show you a parent taking care of his children. Let me show you a scientist working very hard to discover a mathematical proof. Let me show you a worker waking up at 5 a.m. in the morning to go fix the a street that got damaged with a car did something wrong, and so forth and so forth. So the idea is, let's say, maybe it's not something that I can reduce to a single rule, but it is still something that you can subsume under a word that's vague, Gustavo's preference or YouTube, or dignity, but it's perfectly fair thing to say. It's a perfectly rational and perfectly understandable thing to say, and that the prejudice lies in the desire to have to sort of come to this one thing, to this one property that would be the explanation of what is valuable, instead of trying to get you to grasp this more broad thing that is common and shared amongst, Star Trek, Blade Runner, and Star Wars and the Planet of the Apes. However horrible that film might be, okay, Star Wars is also pretty bad. Okay, but anyways, I only like Return of the Jedi. Point being, I think thought in this area is struggling. We seem to have faced the problem that we have concepts, and the concepts that we have don't work very well. And we do seem to find in need probably to change our way of thinking about the topic for it to make sense. And if I take the example, then I think it's a perfectly down to earth and perfectly scientific example of how neural networks work. Maybe we can also come to think that we need a more humanistic understanding of the value of human beings, rather, a more humanistic understanding of dignity, that by being humanistic and vague will not by the same token necessarily be anti-scientific or prejudice or so forth. So there's an idea, and I leave it with you for more thought, because yeah, I think this is an interesting problem.